The fluorescent lights hummed like a bad memory washing the conference room in a thin, sickly glow. Rain pounded the tall windows, blurring the skyline until the city looked like a watercolor running down the glass. Our CEO's tie sat crooked against his starched shirt as he gripped the lectern and cleared his throat. Nobody touched the paper cups on the back table. Nobody breathed. And then he said the sentence that changed my life. Effective immediately, we're reducing the workforce by 30%. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a pen. It sounded like a nail hitting tile. I felt my pulse in my wrists and at the base of my throat. He kept talking non-essential market realities, thank you for your service. Empty words, filling a room that had just been hollowed out. When he finished, thunder rattled the glass. I stared at the Tech Vision logo on the wall and realized it didn't recognize me anymore. 2 hours later, my director slid a folder across her desk and couldn't meet my eyes. The badge around my neck was already deactivated. I tucked a framed photo of my grandparents into a cardboard box and walked past desks where people pretended not to stare. The elevator doors closed. Somewhere above me, my team was still refreshing dashboards I had built, chasing numbers I'd once wrestled into line. The ground floor smelled like rain and printer toner. By the time I stepped onto the wet sidewalk, my title had vanished, but the weight in my chest had not. Before I go further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been made to feel small right when you needed grace, tap that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes the only way through a story like this is together. But to understand what that afternoon set in motion, you need to know where it began, long before the badge, long before the elevator, back when home meant a narrow porch, a creaky swing, and a key that always turned. I grew up learning the difference between noise and voice. Noise was the way my dad Richard filled a room, work boots thudding across oak phone pressed to his ear, orders barked like nails driven into 2x4s. Voice was what my grandma used in her kitchen on Maple Street, where the air smelled like cinnamon and hot sugar. Steady, Christy, she would say, tapping the recipe card with one floury finger. You can't rush a rise. My grandfather taught me the same truth with a different set of tools: how to align a level, how to feel for a stud through drywall, how to set a screw until it's snugged and no more. In their house, patience wasn't weakness, it was skill. At my parents' place, patience sounded like my mother whispering, "Just do what your father says," while pushing the roast around on a too-crowded plate. At my grandparents' house, patience allowed things to become themselves. Tomatoes ripened on the windowsill. A loose chair leg could be sanded and re-glued. A girl who talked about messaging strategy at 8 years old. My lemonade stand needs a poster that looks cold. I told Grandpa could be heard, not laughed at. I carried that house with me into adulthood, even when I lived 20 minutes away in a glass and steel condo with an elevator that never squeaked. Tech Vision rewarded people who could see patterns. I could. I learned how to shape a story until the right customers leaned closer. I worked long and hard, not loudly. At 28, my salary edged past what Dad took home from his construction company during a slow year. I never said a word about it, but he found out anyway. I noticed the way his jaw set at Sunday dinner, the way he chewed without tasting like each bite owed him something. Still, when my parents needed help, I wrote the checks. Ashley's destination wedding came during a cash flow problem at Dad's firm. I covered the gap. When their car died, I put the down payment on the replacement. When Ashley and Jake chose a private school for their firstborn and then hit a patch, I filled the tuition hole. I did it because I could, and because it felt like the right thing, dignity extended in dollars no ledger kept. The last time I saw my grandmother alive, she pressed a brass key into my palm and curled my fingers around it. "This home has always been yours in spirit," she whispered. "Soon it will be yours in truth." At the will reading, the truth walked into the room and sat down at the long mahogany table. The Maple Street house, the porch, the swing, the workbench with Grandpa's labels came to me. My father's voice sharpened until even the lawyer blinked. "She already has a condo," he said. "We're her parents." My mother looked down at her purse. Ashley studied the patterned carpet as if an answer might be woven there. The lawyer was patient. "Your parents were very clear," he said. "They wanted their granddaughter to have the house." I didn't gloat. I mowed the lawn in straight lines and kept Grandma's garden alive, even the stubborn hydrangea that sulked on the north side and wouldn't bloom blue no matter what I fed it. I paid property taxes on time and kept a pot of coffee warm for Saturday mornings when it mattered. Life settled into a rhythm, projects at work that sang long runs on the trail, friends who laughed in kitchens after midnight. The house on Maple Street remained my refuge, a quiet place where love had a sound. Then came the town hall, the crooked tie, and the cardboard box. For the first 3 weeks after the layoff, power lines hummed, and nothing in me panicked. I updated my resume. I called recruiters who used to call me. I drank coffee on the Maple Street porch and told myself, "You have 6 months of cushion. You've delivered numbers that don't lie. Someone will see it." But the market turned, and then it turned again. Promises thinned into circling back. The inbox filled with polite rejections that read like they'd been written by software. The 6-week plan stretched to 3 months, then 6. I cooked at home and canceled subscriptions. I mapped every expense like a general counting supplies. The night I called my father, the sky over Maple Street looked like bruised fruit. I stood at the kitchen sink and traced a crack in the tile with my thumb while the line rang twice. He answered with the voice he used for employees who missed a delivery window. "What now, Christy?" I told him the truth. The mortgage was coming due and the condo hadn't sold. "1 month of help," I said. "I can pay it back with interest." Silence, and then the sound of a man slamming a door you can't see. "You should have planned better," he said. "Maybe now you'll learn responsibility." I reminded him. I had never asked before that I'd helped when they needed it. He didn't sigh. He didn't soften. "That was your choice," he said. "You wanted the downtown lifestyle. Your grandparents enabled you with that house. If you're desperate, sell it." He hung up. I watched the second hand sweep the kitchen clock, its tick too loud in a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The refrigerator hummed. The porch light threw a yellow oval across the front walk. I waited for my mother to call back. She did 20 minutes later, her kindness tucked inside caution like a letter in a sealed envelope. "We can't help right now," she said softly. "Have you considered a roommate?" When Ashley called, her sympathy was upholstered in velvet and tacks. "This economy is terrible," she said. "You could make a fortune selling Grandma and Grandpa's place." Out on the porch, the swing creaked. Inside, my grandmother's recipe box sat next to the salt cellar, as if it were just another kitchen tool. I slid into a chair and held the Maple Street key for a long time, feeling the warmth leave it. The days changed shape. I learned how quiet a house can get at noon on a Tuesday. The mail slot clacked and brought more bills and fewer possibilities. I opened the windows for air and watched dust turn to gold in the light. I wrote cover letters that were careful but not pleading. When companies wrote back, if they wrote back, they thanked me for my interest and chose someone else. I stopped checking Facebook, then checked it anyway. Ashley posted a photo of a backyard barbecue, paper lanterns, my father smiling at the grill, my mother laughing with a neighbor. There was no space where I should have been. No caption that said, "Wish you were here." I set the phone face down and listened to the house breathe the faint whir of the ceiling fan, the weight of footsteps passing under silence. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a car door closed, and a woman laughed. The world kept moving, like a river I was no longer wading in, when the mortgage notice came stiff paper black ink that did not care about any kitchen in any American house. I took a deep breath and dialed again. My father's hello was a wall. "Dad," I said, "I'm going to miss this payment. I can make it right next month." He didn't argue. He dismissed. "You made your bed," he said. "Now lie in it." The line went dead, and with it, the last little hope that family means help when the floor falls away. I set the phone on the counter and noticed my hands were shaking. Not fast, just steadily like a machine left running. The porch light clicked on against the early winter dusk. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stood in the doorway where the warm air met the cold. Across the street, a neighbor lifted a toddler out of a car seat and kissed a small hat. Someone turned on a lamp in a front room. It lit the window in a soft square that looked like safety. Behind me, the Maple Street house, my house, now held everything I knew how to keep clean: floors, a stocked pantry, a garden put to bed. It also held the thing I suddenly understood I might have to defend. The thought arrived like a thin blade of air and parted something inside me. This house had been given to me out of love. Now, with my job gone and my worth questioned, it sat like a target. Later that week, my sister's voice turned practical the way it always did when she wanted to sound neutral while moving a piece across a board. "We're all tightening belts," she said. "You can't have everything, Christy." It was the kind of sentence that sounds harmless until you said it next to the truth. She had everything she wanted. She was telling me to let go of the one thing that wasn't hers. I didn't argue. I learned a long time ago that argument only fed the fire. I made rice, put the leftover chicken into a small Tupperware, and stacked tomorrow's lunch in the fridge. I laid the mortgage notice beneath a paperweight on Grandpa's old desk and sat where he used to sit to label jars of screws. The room smelled faintly of pine and lemon oil. I pressed my fingers against the grain until the ridges left lines on my skin. After midnight, I crawled into bed and watched headlights drift across the ceiling. A wind pushed down Maple Street, and the porch swing bumped its chain against the bracket with a soft, steady knock. I counted the knocks like you count breaths in a waiting room. Somewhere between 30 and 40, the central heat kicked on, sighed through the vents, and warmed the room by a single degree. In the morning, a new email waited in my inbox. The subject line said, "We appreciate your interest." The body said everything I already knew. I made coffee, wrapped my hands around the mug for the heat, and lifted the shade. Frost edged the garden where Grandma used to lay marigold seed in late April. The sun rose slow and pale over the old maple tree at the curb. That's where I stood when a thought I did not invite arrived, and refused to leave if help wasn't coming. What else might be? The answer didn't speak in words. It showed me a black SUV idling at the curb, a minivan easing in behind it, doors opening in quick succession. It showed me familiar faces walking up my front path as if they owned it. The coffee went cool in my hands. I set the mug down on the sill and watched the street until the light sharpened and the frost burned away. The house was quiet except for the clock on the kitchen wall ticking like a metronome. It kept time while something in me shifted no louder than the turning of a key in an old lock. And in that small, precise silence, the kind you only notice when the noise stops, I understood the road I was standing on had split. One way led back toward begging and explanations. The other led forward into a winter I hadn't asked for, where the only thing standing between me and the cold would be a brass key, 4 walls, and whatever courage I could find in a house built by people who believed I belonged. The frost melted. The street stayed empty, but the porch light flickered once as if the house itself were warning me, "Get ready." The days after that, frost felt longer than they should have. The air on Maple Street carried the sharpness of winter coming early, and the silence inside the house had a new kind of weight. I spent my mornings at the kitchen table scrolling through job listings that all blurred into the same polite refusals. My savings dropped each week like sand through an hourglass. I told myself to stay steady, the way Grandma used to say when a recipe needed patience. But some mornings, the air in the house felt so still it hummed. I'd move from room to room, touching things that used to belong to her and Grandpa. A chipped mug, a wooden spoon worn smooth by her hand, reminding myself that they had trusted me to build something worth keeping. One evening, the last of the daylight stretched across the living room floor, and I sat there reading another rejection email. The words were kind enough, but the meaning was cold. I closed my laptop and pressed my forehead against my knees. Outside, someone's wind chime tinkled in the breeze. That sound, gentle as it was, made my chest ache. Weeks became months. The people I thought would check on me didn't. Calls to my parents went unanswered except for a few clipped responses from my mother suggesting I simplify my life. My sister posted pictures of family dinners, my father carving roast beef at the head of the table. No one left an empty chair for me. Holidays came and went. On Thanksgiving morning, I made instant potatoes and green beans in a single pan and watched the steam fog the window. Across the street, the Patterson house glowed with laughter. I didn't resent them. It was the absence of my own family that hurt like a cold draft sneaking under the door, no matter how tightly it was shut. When the bills started to stack higher than the mail tray could hold, I cut what I could. Cable went first, then the streaming services, then the small luxuries that used to fill weekends. I sold my condo furniture piece by piece. My wardrobe shrank to what I needed for interviews that never happened. Each morning, I made coffee not because I wanted it, but because it kept the house smelling like someone lived there. Then I'd pull on a coat and walk to the library for Wi-Fi using their heater as long as I could before the staff announced closing time. Those walks became my daily rhythm, the sound of my boots crunching against the old sidewalk. Some nights, I'd lie awake listening to the furnace click on and off, counting the seconds between cycles to make sure it was still working. I thought about calling my father again, but I could still hear the edge in his voice from the last conversation. "You made your bed." It played in my head like a line from a film I didn't choose to watch. One afternoon, while carrying a bag of groceries home from the discount store, the bottom split open. My last $5 worth of food scattered across the wet pavement, potatoes rolling toward the gutter, apples bouncing off the curb. I bent to gather them, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then from behind me, a voice said softly, "Hold on, I've got it." A woman knelt beside me, her coat sleeves streaked with rain. She picked up the fallen apples and dropped them carefully back into the bag. Her smile was small, but steady. "Looks like we're both having a Monday," she said. I almost laughed. She offered me a clean paper sack and told me to keep it. That's how I met Diana. She was a freelance graphic designer who rented a small house a few streets over. We ended up walking together, talking about work, or the lack of it, and the way the world seemed to reward the loudest people first. Her calmness made space for me to breathe again. She told me about a community center that offered free career counseling and therapy sessions. The next week, I went. The counselor there helped me reshape my resume, not to hide the gap, but to explain it. The therapist helped me unpack the ache I'd been carrying, the kind that no amount of budgeting could fix. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. That winter, I took a temporary job at the grocery store. It wasn't glamorous 8 hours on my feet scanning items I couldn't afford, but the rhythm steadied me. The manager, a patient man named Carl, gave me extra shifts when others called out. He said I worked like someone who understood what a paycheck meant. At home, I learned to stretch everything: soup from bones, bread from scratch. I kept the thermostat low and wore 2 sweaters, watching my breath fog in the early mornings. The garden out back was still bare, but the soil waited, and that waiting felt like something familiar, like hope hiding under frost. One evening, while cleaning a cabinet, I found my grandmother's old recipe box tucked behind a stack of pans. The cards were yellowed and soft at the edges. On one of them, in her careful cursive, it said, "Chicken and dumplings made with love, not haste." I cooked it that night. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and alive. For a moment, the house felt like it used to. When spring came, I found Grandpa's gardening tools in the shed, their handles smooth and ready. I planted lettuce, tomatoes, and beans using his old guides, though the ground fought me at first. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Patterson brought over seedlings, saying Walter would be proud to see you out there. Her kindness cracked something open inside me. Little by little, the neighborhood became a lifeline. Mr. Castillo across the street paid me to fix his computer. A retired teacher asked me to walk her dog when her arthritis flared up. Small jobs led to small paychecks, and those kept the lights on. For the first time since losing my job, I wasn't counting down to empty, but loneliness still crept in like the wind under the eaves. Sometimes I'd see my sister's posts, family trips, new furniture, smiles all around, and wonder how the same blood could feel so cold. I stopped checking after a while. That December, an ice storm rolled in. The power lines bowed under the weight and snapped somewhere down the block. My house went dark for 3 days. The temperature dropped to 45 degrees inside. I huddled under every blanket I owned, listening to the wind batter the windows. My phone battery died before morning. The silence was complete. When the lights finally came back, I checked my email out of habit. Another rejection. Something in me gave way quietly the way snow slides from a roof. I sat on the couch, hands folded, and realized there was nothing left to lose. And then, as if the universe had heard the thought, something changed. It happened on a gray Tuesday at the grocery store. A man at self-checkout was struggling with the scanner, muttering under his breath. I stepped over to help him, guiding him through the screen prompts. He looked at me with relief. "You've got a clear way of explaining things," he said. "Our company could use someone like you." I smiled, thinking he was being polite. But then he handed me a business card. Marcus Hall. It read, "Precision Engineering." He said his firm built prototypes but struggled with marketing. "We know how to make things," he said. "We just don't know how to tell people why they matter." That night at my grandmother's table, I studied his company's website. The copy was flat, the images mismatched. I couldn't help myself. I started making notes. By the time I looked up, the clock read midnight. The next day I called him. Our meeting was supposed to last an hour. It went 3. I walked him through what his team could improve: branding, layout, customer language. He listened like a man hearing a foreign language he finally understood. When I finished, he said, "Would you consider consulting with us?" He offered more for a week's work than I earned in 2. I said yes. At first, it felt temporary, like a borrowed moment, but when the first campaign I created boosted his leads by nearly a third, he extended the contract. Then he introduced me to another small firm that needed help. Word spread quietly. By summer, I was working from my dining room table, the same one where Grandma used to roll out pie crust. I pulled Grandpa's desk from the basement and turned the spare room into an office. I learned to build websites, manage analytics, design logos. Each skill stacked on the last until my confidence felt like a house under construction, solid plank by plank. Diana came by one afternoon with iced coffee and looked around at the piles of folders and cables. "You're not just freelancing," she said. "You're building something." She was right. By autumn, I had steady clients and enough savings to breathe. The panic that once lived in my chest eased into focus. I paid down debt, canceled the condo sale, and found a tenant instead. For the first time since Tech Vision, I didn't wake up afraid. On Saturdays, I worked in the garden while the neighborhood kids rode bikes past the gate. Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch. Mr. Castillo brought over a basket of peaches. The house that had once been my lifeboat was becoming something larger, a home built on my own hands and the quiet kindness of strangers. Sometimes late at night, I'd look through the front window toward the streetlight shining through the old maple branches and think about my family. The anger had dulled, but the ache remained a small bruise that never quite faded. I still wondered if they ever thought about me, or if I had simply been erased. I didn't know that silence had a shape. Until then, it can sit at your table, walk behind you in every room, and still not make a sound. Still, that silence also made space. It let me rebuild without their voices crowding my own. It taught me to trust my own work again. And on a warm afternoon, nearly 18 months later, when the garden was thick with tomatoes and the air smelled like earth and basil, my phone buzzed with a message that made my hands still. It was from Ashley. "Been too long," she wrote. "Coffee this week." No apology, no mention of the years that had gone missing. Just an invitation with a smile that didn't reach the words. I stared at the screen, the sunlight turning it pale in my hand. For a long moment, I didn't know if I was angry or curious. Then I typed back one word, "sure," and pressed send. The porch swing creaked in the breeze, slow and rhythmic. Somewhere deep down, a quiet instinct stirred one that sounded a lot like warning. The cafe was bright and carefully staged, all glass walls and brass light fixtures. Ashley was already there when I arrived, stirring sugar into a drink that looked too perfect to taste. She waved me over like we'd seen each other last week instead of a year and a half ago. "You look great," she said, before I'd even sat down. "You've lost weight. Business must be keeping you busy." I smiled politely, trying not to show how much that last word caught in my chest. Business. She said it the way our father used to say hobby. We talked about surface things first. The weather, her kids, her husband's new project. But every question she asked about my work circled back to money. How many clients? What kind of contracts? Was I still living in the Maple Street house? When I mentioned the upgrades and the garden, she leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The neighborhood's booming," she said. "You could sell for triple what Grandma and Grandpa paid. A developer offered Mom and Dad a fortune for their rental. They might have to sell soon, you know. It's been hard for them." Her tone softened, but it wasn't concern, it was strategy. When she finally looked up from her untouched coffee, her expression settled into the one she used as a teenager whenever she was about to get her way. "They're struggling, Christy. You got the house when you were already doing well. Maybe it's time to share the blessing." For a moment, I just stared at her. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, the sound rattling the windows. I took a slow breath. "The house was Grandma and Grandpa's gift," I said. "It's my home now. It's not just property to me." Her smile disappeared. "So you won't help your own parents? After everything they did for you?" I thought of the phone calls unanswered, the silence through holidays, the months when I'd eaten canned soup under 2 blankets. My hands stayed still around the coffee cup. Ashley, when I needed help, they told me to sell it. You all did. She stood up quickly, gathering her purse. "You can't hold grudges forever," she said. "Blood is thicker than water, Christy. Don't forget that." Then she walked out, leaving the doorbell to chime behind her. 3 days later, my father called. His voice filled the phone like static. "Ashley tells me you're unwilling to help family," he said. "After all we've done for you, you turn your back now. Your mother's heartbroken." "Dad, you always were selfish," he cut in. "That house should have been ours from the start. Your grandparents would be ashamed of how you've handled things." He hung up before I could respond. The silence after the call was heavy, the kind that presses against the walls. Outside, the sky had gone gray, and a cold rain streaked the windows. By the end of the week, I heard from 3 different cousins, all asking variations of the same question. "Is it true you won't help your parents?" Someone had told them I was sitting on a fortune. One even said she'd heard I threatened to sue. It was like watching smoke fill a room while realizing you were the only one inside who knew the fire wasn't real. I tried to focus on work, but even there, the tension followed. One afternoon, at a local business mixer, Aunt Lorraine cornered me by the refreshment table. "We're all just worried," she said loudly enough for nearby ears. Family is supposed to share their blessings. I managed a tight smile and excused myself, but my pulse stayed high long after I left. That evening, I told Jennifer, my attorney friend, everything. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back in her chair. "You need to start documenting," she said. "This isn't just gossip. They're trying to pressure you into something illegal. Install cameras, keep copies of everything. If they show up, don't engage, call the police." Her calm voice steadied me, but the idea of needing protection from my own family made my stomach twist. Still that night, I ordered a security system and installed it myself the next morning. I told myself it was just a precaution, but a part of me knew better. The next few weeks passed in uneasy quiet. My business kept me busy: client calls, project deadlines, early mornings in the garden when the air still held a trace of dew. The house looked peaceful, but underneath, something felt unsettled, like the earth before a storm. Then came that Saturday morning. The day was bright, the air cool enough to see my breath when I opened the back door. I'd planned to harvest the last of the tomatoes before the frost set in. I was halfway through my coffee when I heard the sound, car doors slamming one after another. Through the window, I saw them. My father's black SUV, my mother's sedan, Ashley's minivan pulling in behind. They stepped out in a small huddle, their faces already set. The doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my father brushed past me without a word, the smell of his aftershave still sharp from the cold. My mother followed, smiling too brightly. "We need to talk, honey. Family business." "I didn't invite you in," I said, but they were already moving through the foyer. Ashley drifted into the living room, trailing her fingers over the furniture, as if she were appraising it. Jake wandered toward the kitchen, murmuring something about the new countertops. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, folding her hands like she was about to deliver bad news she'd already accepted. My father turned from the bookshelf, his jaw set. "We're here to correct your grandparents' mistake," he said. "Excuse me? They never meant for you to keep this place forever," he continued. "It was supposed to be temporary until you were stable again. Now that you're doing well, it's time to share with the family." I looked from one face to another, waiting for someone to blink, to laugh, to show a trace of humanity. No one did. Jake came back holding a folder. "Property values here have tripled," he said. "It doesn't make sense for one person to hold all that when the family needs support." My father stepped closer. "You'll sign the house over to your mother and me. You can stay in the guest room until you find a place. When we sell, you'll get your fair share adjusted for rent, of course." It took a moment for his words to register. When they did, the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. Ashley leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "It's the only fair solution, Christy." I shook my head slowly. "No, this house is mine. Grandpa and Grandma wanted it that way." My mother opened her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "We found this among her things," she said. "It clearly states she wanted the house to return to me once you were back on your feet." She held it out like a peace offering. The paper was too clean, the ink too fresh. I didn't touch it. That's not her handwriting. Ashley stepped closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Legal battles are expensive. Clients won't want to work with someone in the middle of a lawsuit." "Think carefully," Jake added. "Sign it, and we'll make this easy. Refuse, and we'll make it public." The kitchen clock ticked once, twice. Then I heard drawers opening in the next room, my mother going through the desk. Ashley walking toward the hallway, with her phone raised, taking pictures of the rooms. Jake picked up a stack of client files from my office desk and started flipping through them. My voice came out low, almost too calm. "You need to leave. Now." My father laughed under his breath. "You've never deserved this place. A real daughter would help her parents." I stared at him, the weight of every year between us pressing into my ribs. "I rebuilt my life without a single thing from you," I said. "And I'll protect what's mine." He took a step forward, but I was already moving. I walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and called 911. My hands were steady as I explained what was happening. "They entered without permission," I said quietly. "They're threatening me and handling my property. The dispatcher told me to stay put until officers arrived." From behind the door, I could hear them moving through the house cupboard doors, opening, the sound of glass clinking, my father's voice rising in frustration. 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Through the window, I saw 2 uniformed officers on the porch. I stepped out of the bathroom just as my father opened the front door to meet them. He was already talking fast, his tone measured. "It's a family dispute," he said. "We're just trying to resolve some inheritance confusion." The older officer looked past him to me. "Ma'am, did you make the call?" "Yes. This is my home." He asked for documents, and I handed over the deed, the will, the property tax statements. The officers read them quietly, then turned to my father. "This property is legally hers," the older one said. "You all need to leave." My father's face flushed. "You can't be serious. We're her family. Without her permission or a court order, you have no right to be here," the officer said firmly. "You need to leave now." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ashley let out a sharp breath and started gathering her purse. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "How could you call the police on us?" I met her gaze. "The same way you could abandon your daughter when she needed you most." The officers escorted them out. My father stopped at the door, his voice low but hard. "You've made a serious mistake today, Christy." I looked him straight in the eye. "The mistake was thinking you could still control me." He didn't reply. The door closed behind them and the house went still. When the officers left, I locked every window and door, then walked through each room in silence. Papers scattered across the floor. Drawers open. My grandmother's china cabinet left ajar. I gathered each thing carefully, setting it back where it belonged, as though restoring order might quiet the tremor still running through me. By the time the sun went down, the house was calm again. I sat at the kitchen table where my grandmother once rolled dough and let the silence stretch until it felt like peace. The brass key lay in my palm, warm from the heat of my skin. That night, I made one promise to myself. I wouldn't wait for the next storm to hit. The time for hoping they would change was over. Outside, the porch light burned steady against the dark. Inside, I began planning how to make the boundaries permanent. The morning after they were escorted out, the house felt both safe and shaken, like a storm had passed, but left the air too still. I moved through each room quietly, touching the edges of drawers they'd opened, straightening what they'd disturbed. The sunlight through the kitchen window looked ordinary again, but my trust in that peace was gone. Jennifer called around noon. Her voice was calm, efficient. "Go to the courthouse first thing Monday," she said. "File for a restraining order while everything's still fresh. Bring the police report photos, timestamps, everything you can document." I wrote down each step as she spoke. When we hung up, I sat at the table where Grandma used to cool her pies and stared at the list. The ink looked too sharp against the paper, but the plan gave me something solid to hold. That weekend, I changed the locks. The locksmith, An older man with kind eyes worked quietly as I stood by the doorway. When he handed me the new set of keys, I felt something tighten and release in my chest. "Bad tenants?" he asked. "Something like that," I said, and left it at that. After he drove off, I installed the new security cameras Jennifer had suggested. Each quiet click of a screw going in steadied me. It was the sound of boundaries being built. Monday came cold and gray. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. I filed the restraining order describing the confrontation as clearly as I could. The clerk didn't flinch when I handed over the report. She just nodded as if she'd seen hundreds of families tear themselves apart in that same building. The judge granted the temporary order immediately. "Family disputes escalate faster than most people expect," he said, sliding the signed papers toward me. "Better to draw a clear line now." His words stayed with me all day. By evening, I'd placed every document deed will restraining order insurance papers into a fireproof box. Then I drove to the bank and locked them in a safe deposit drawer. When I got home, the house looked smaller but stronger, like it had decided to protect itself too. The first few days felt raw. Every creak made me look toward the window. I kept the porch light on longer than usual, its glow stretching across the lawn like a promise. Work helped. My clients knew nothing of the chaos behind the scenes, and I wanted to keep it that way. Their trust gave me something worth defending. Maybe that's why in the middle of all the fear my business began to grow. New referrals came in through word of mouth. Projects multiplied. I spent long evenings designing campaigns, the glow from my monitor soft against the kitchen walls. The house hummed with the same quiet energy it once had when Grandpa worked late in his shop. 3 months later, I hired my first full-time employee, Sophia Hayes, a marketing graduate who reminded me of myself 10 years ago. She arrived early on her first day holding a notebook and a nervous smile. "This place feels like home," she said, looking around the converted office. "That's the idea," I told her. Teaching her became its own kind of healing. We set up a rhythm morning coffee in the kitchen, mid-afternoon walks to clear our heads. She listened, learned quickly, and laughed easily. The house, which had once echoed with silence, filled with the sound of work and life again. Diana stopped by often, too, bringing design sketches or lunch she'd cooked herself. Some days she'd sit across from me while I worked, tapping her pencil against the table. "You're different now," she said once. Stronger, but quieter about it. Maybe she was right. Strength didn't feel like a roar anymore. It felt like steady breathing, like keeping your word to yourself. Therapy helped me see that clearly. Dr. Levine had a calm, measured voice that never rushed. One afternoon, she leaned back in her chair and said, "What happened during your unemployment wasn't new, Christy. It was just the loudest version of a pattern that's always been there." I knew she was right. My father's control, my mother's silence, Ashley's easy compliance, it all stretched back further than I'd allowed myself to admit. Seeing it laid out like that wasn't painful in the way I expected. It was clarifying, like turning a map right side up after being lost for years. When the hearing for the restraining order came, Diana insisted on going with me. My family arrived with a lawyer of their own. They looked smaller than I remembered. My father's posture still carried authority, but the edges had dulled. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. Ashley sat beside them, eyes down, lips pressed tight. Their attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, as someone blowing a misunderstanding out of proportion. But when the judge read the police report, the photos, and the statement from the responding officers, his expression didn't change once. Given the evidence, he said the temporary order will become permanent. The respondents are prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect. My father muttered something under his breath. The gavel fell. It sounded final. Outside the courthouse, he stepped toward me before the officers could stop him. His voice was sharp but quieter than it used to be. "You'll regret this, Christy. You can't replace family. Before I could respond, Diana moved between us, calm but firm. She already has family, she said. One that actually cares if she's safe. He blinked at her like she'd spoken in another language. Then he turned and walked away, my mother trailing behind Ashley, glancing back once before following them down the steps. That night, Diana and I sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The garden below was dark, except for the faint shimmer of dew on the leaves. You know, she said softly, not everyone gets to stand up for themselves and still keep their kindness intact. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. The night air smelled faintly of rain and rosemary. As winter passed, peace began to settle into the corners of my life. Work grew steadier. Sophia became more confident taking on clients of her own. I started hosting small dinners, friends, neighbors, people who had become my chosen circle. The house that once sheltered only my grief now held laughter again. By spring, it felt right to open the doors wider. I decided to host a community dinner just like Grandma used to. We borrowed tables and chairs from neighbors, pushed furniture aside, and strung lights through the dining room and living room. When the evening came, 25 people filled the house. Mrs. Patterson brought her apple pie. Mr. Castillo played his guitar after dinner, Sophia helped serve, and Diana managed everything with the easy grace of someone who'd always known how to build warmth out of thin air. At one point, I stood in the doorway between rooms watching them all. The glow from the hanging lights caught the framed photo of my grandparents on the mantel. Their smiles were small knowing. For the first time, I felt like I finally understood what they'd meant when they said the house was mine in spirit. It wasn't about ownership, it was about safety, belonging, continuity. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the dishes were drying in neat rows, I went up to the attic to put away the extra linens. Dust floated in the beam from my flashlight, swirling like slow snow. That's when I saw it, a plain cardboard box I'd never noticed before, tucked behind an old chest. Inside were stacks of journals, my grandmother's neat handwriting filling each page. The ink had faded to soft brown, but the words were strong. She had written about family gatherings, about Grandpa's health, about me. One entry stopped me cold. It was dated the year I graduated college. Richard continues to undermine Christy's confidence. Karen says nothing. We've decided to change our will. The house must go directly to Christy. She'll need a safe haven when the inevitable conflict comes. I closed the book carefully, hands trembling just enough to make the pages whisper. They had seen it all. They had prepared for it. They had loved me enough to protect me even when they wouldn't be here to explain why. I sat on the attic floor for a long time, the smell of old cedar and paper surrounding me. The box beside me wasn't just a record of their lives, it was evidence of their intent, the truth written in their own hands. I didn't know then how much those journals would matter, how they'd later become the final word that ended every claim my parents tried to make. That would come later. For now, I closed the attic door and carried one journal downstairs. On the last page, in smaller letters, my grandmother had written a single line: "Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shares your hope." The porch light was still on when I stepped outside. The night was cool, quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. I stood on the porch, feeling the rough wood under my bare feet, and looked out over the garden that was slowly coming back to life. The boundaries were finally clear. The house, the business, the people who filled my days, they were all mine to protect and to nurture. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next loss. I was living inside something I had built myself, steady as the light spilling across the yard. The following morning opened soft and gold. A thin mist clung to the garden, curling above the soil before lifting into the air. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It simply was quiet, steady, awake. I made coffee and carried it onto the porch. The wood under my bare feet was cool, still damp from the night. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's curtains moved slightly. She always rose with the sun. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Ordinary sounds, but they filled the air like a gentle anthem. The court case had ended a week ago. The judge's dismissal had been short and clear. Their lawyer had tried to stretch the argument one last time, waving that forged letter as if it were sacred. But my grandmother's journals, those careful dated entries written in her steady hand, spoke for themselves. When the gavel fell, my parents didn't even look my way. The sound was final, almost merciful. I hadn't seen them since. The silence that followed felt strange at first, like walking in a room after the music stops. But as days passed, that quiet turned from absence into peace. My world had grown small and beautiful. Sophia had become not just an employee, but a true partner, bright, curious, full of ideas that reminded me what it felt like to be starting out. Diana often worked from the house now, her laughter carrying through the open windows, while she sketched designs at the dining table. One afternoon, I found her outside on the porch legs tucked under her as she worked on her laptop. She glanced up when I stepped out with iced tea. "You ever think they'd come around?" she asked softly. I thought for a moment. The garden below us shimmered in the heat rows of tomato vines, heavy with fruit. Maybe I said, but it wouldn't change anything. I finally understand it's not about getting them to see me. It's about seeing myself clearly without their noise. She smiled that quiet, knowing smile she had when words weren't really necessary. By early summer, the house had become more than a home. It was alive again. We added an office addition off the back, designed to look like it had always belonged. Light poured through its tall windows every morning, landing across the desk that once sat in Grandpa's basement. The air carried the faint scent of cut wood and fresh paint. When the contractor finished, he stood beside me in the doorway, wiping dust from his hands. "Feels like this place has good bones," he said. "It always did," I replied. The business kept expanding. Small companies reached out from other states, asking for consultations. I hired 2 more staff members by fall. Sophia managed her own accounts, and watching her succeed filled me with the kind of pride that never demanded attention. It was quiet, steady, honest. At night, I'd sometimes sit on the porch swing with the journals spread across my lap. The pages had grown fragile with age, their corners soft from turning. One evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, I found an entry I hadn't noticed before. It was short, only a few sentences, but it felt like a whisper meant for me. "Christy doesn't see how strong she already is. One day she will. When she does this, house will finally belong to her in every way that matters." I closed the book and looked toward the garden where fireflies had begun to appear one by one. They hovered low among the rows of beans and marigolds, blinking in slow rhythm, patient and unhurried. For the first time, I didn't feel the ache of loss when I thought of my grandparents. I felt their presence as something woven into every beam and floorboard, a quiet kind of love that never asked to be thanked. A few months later, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a short letter from my mother. "I know I don't deserve a reply. I just needed you to know that I read your grandmother's journals. I didn't realize how long she had seen what I refused to. I hope you're happy. Please take care of yourself." No apology, just a line that sounded like fatigue wrapped in love. I didn't write back, but I folded the letter neatly and placed it between the pages of the journal where my grandmother had written about forgiveness. Some doors didn't need to close with a slam. Sometimes they could rest quietly in the frame no longer used, but still intact. By the third winter, the house looked almost unrecognizable from the one I'd inherited. The porch was painted a fresh shade of deep green. The kitchen gleamed under soft pendant lights. My office walls were lined with framed photographs of every project that had helped me rebuild. Each image told its own story of perseverance. Small companies finding their voice. Single mothers launching side businesses, veterans returning to work with new purpose. The scholarship fund we launched in my grandparents' name had grown beyond what I first imagined. We sponsored women re-entering the workforce, helping them gain marketing skills and confidence. Each recipient wrote a short note when they completed the program. I kept them all in a wooden box on my desk, reading them whenever I needed to remember how far things could travel when they began from good intentions. One afternoon, Sophia brought in a stack of envelopes, new applicants for the next round. "It's amazing what you've built," she said, setting them down gently. I looked out the window at the maple tree that shaded the yard. "It's what they would have wanted," I said, "something that keeps giving." That evening, the first snow began to fall. The garden lay asleep beneath a thin white sheet, but the air smelled alive, cold, clean, full of promise. I lit the old porch lantern, the one Grandpa used to fix every spring, and watched the light flicker through the snowfall. Diana arrived later with soup and bread, her cheeks pink from the cold. We ate by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow across the walls. She stretched her legs toward the hearth and sighed contentedly. "You've turned this place into something remarkable," she said. "Not just the house. Your whole life." I smiled into my mug. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I just stopped trying to prove I deserved it." The wind moved through the trees outside, low and steady. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time. When she left, I walked her to her car and stood in the driveway watching her taillights disappear down Maple Street. The snow kept falling, covering her tracks as quickly as they appeared. The night had that soft hush that only comes after the world has forgiven itself for a long storm. Inside, the clock in the hallway ticked steadily. The house breathed around me, floorboards, settling pipes, humming faintly. I turned off the lights one by one until only the porch lantern remained, its glow spilling across the floor in warm, uneven shapes. I went out to the porch and sat on the swing, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. The air was cold enough to sting, but clean enough to make me feel alive. From where I sat, I could see the reflection of the lantern light on the frozen garden shimmering like a memory that refused to fade. I thought about everything it had taken to reach this peace, the loss, the silence, the hard boundaries that finally held. And yet none of it felt heavy anymore. It just felt true. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine from down the street. I closed my eyes and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang 9 times. Each chime stretched into the night like a reminder that time moves on whether we do or not. When I finally went inside, the warmth met me at the door. I paused in the entryway, looking once more at the photograph of Grandma and Grandpa. The edges of the frame caught the light, and for a heartbeat, it looked as though they were standing in it, smiling, certain unafraid. I smiled back. "Thank you," I whispered. Peace had become something simple, something quiet enough to fit in the space between breaths. I had learned that some battles end not with victory, but with understanding that surviving is its own kind of grace, and rebuilding is its reward. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and steady, covering the steps, the yard, the world. Inside, the house stayed warm and bright, the kind of light that doesn't ask to be seen, but simply continues to shine. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you believe in quiet strength and second chances, share this with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for being here. Sometimes peace isn't found. It's built one small choice at a time until it feels like home.